Prologue. West and away the wheels of darkness roll. Day's beamy banner up the east is borne. Spectres and fears, the nightmare and her foal, drown in the golden deluge of the morn. A. E. Houseman. China is a vast country. When night falls in the east, the west is still lit up. When darkness covers the south, the north remains bright. Hence, one need not worry about whether there is room to move around. Mao Zedong. All through the spring season, the Earth's canted axis swings ever closer into line with the sun. Each day more heat is concentrated on the crust of the northern hemisphere until, with the arrival of the summer solstice, the full force of the solar fire is turned on the seas and mountains, the deserts and the plains of the temperate zone. This heat bakes the rocks until they flake, sets forest and tundra steaming, vaporizes the surface of the lakes and oceans. In the vast turbulence of the atmosphere thus created, gigantic mushrooms of hot air push skyward from the heart of continents and suck inland beneath them the cool, rain-laden sea winds that break the spring drought. So vast is the continent of Asia, so immense the winter-stilled and frozen wastes of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, and Tibet, so chilled the deserts of the Gobi and Taklamakan that the solstice has come and gone. The Arctic pole has already turned from the sun, and the days have already begun to grow shorter before the accumulated heat of Central Asian sand and rock can reverse the seasons and bring on the monsoon. This ancient lag, this ever-recurring cosmic overlap of heat and cold, cold and heat, brings a violence to the climate of all North China that is incalculable in its effect. From February to June, cold winds blow from Mongolia outward toward the sea, gripping all the land from the Yangtze to the Amur in drought. Then, after weeks of hot and pregnant calm, the skies reverse themselves. Fierce torrential rains sweep in from the Pacific. Flash floods carve up the earthen hills of Shanxi and Shenxi, swell the rivers with mud-clogged water, and inundate the flat plains bordering the sea. These plains are, in fact, a creation of this cycle. But for the silt flung into the rivers and deposited over the millenniums on the ocean floor, the Yellow Sea would still lap the Taihong Mountains on Shanxi's border, and Shantung's hills would still be, as they were in ancient times, an island range. The great coastal plain of China, mother to a 10th part of the human race, is thus herself the child of a monsoon which never ceases to harass the world it has created. The very winds, upon which all rains and hence all life depend, periodically threaten the very existence of that life. Drought and flood, flood and drought, alternating in perpetual procession, yearly call the Chinese people to battle against the waters that sustain them. The year 1947 was no exception. If anything, the rains that summer came earlier and fell more heavily than usual. Even before the end of June, the drought-cracked fields of Hopei and the sun-baked soil of Shanxi's mountain valleys had lost their structure completely and dissolved into mud. Carts bogged to the axles. Mules, their sweating flanks stained red from the earth thrown up by their churning hooves, strained in the harness, lurched forward, and fell back panting. Along a million once solid tracks connecting village to village, field to field, in a network that covered the countryside like a filigree of lace, the battle between the carters and the husbandmen spread with ever-increasing intensity. At each mud hole, the carters tried to detour onto the more solid, crop-firmed soil of the fields themselves. But the peasants, determined to defend their developing harvests, countered with deep pits dug beside the road to keep the carts in line. As the season wore on, these pits grew into a system of interconnected moats and trenches until the countryside took on the appearance of a plain prepared for war. This contest, as old as the wheel itself, never slackened as long as the rains continued to fall. Nor could there be, by nature of the combat, any final victory or defeat, but only an infinite series of minor catastrophes. Here a cart overturned in a water-filled trap, there a field of green corn mangled in the mud. And while this persistent battle between man and man intensified, a larger struggle between man and nature unfolded week by week. With each succeeding rain, the hollows and the low spots of the land filled up with water. The muddy overflow spilled onto the crops. Small gullies that, 10 months of the year, lay dry and dusty, suddenly bulged with flowing water. Whole villages were threatened. Between and around all this, the rivers, the Yungting, the Ying, the Qin, the Hutou, and the Wei, rose and swelled and rose some more to menace whole counties. Meanwhile, to the south, from the gap in the mountains called Sanmen, the great yellow river itself, China's sorrow, laughed at the top of its dikes, and spread fear throughout 3 provinces. Throughout the liberated areas of the North Country, the Battle of the Rivers was joined. Footnote. The liberated areas was the name originally given to those extensive tracts of countryside that were liberated from Japanese control by the 8th Root Army and its supporting militia during the years 1937 to 1945. Since liberation usually begins in mountainous regions, straddling the lines between provinces, these areas were also called border regions. During the Civil War, they expanded greatly. Along threatened dikes, vast armies of men, women, and children toiled day and night, carrying earth in wicker baskets, firming it down with rope-flung tamping stones, and fixing in place the rock-laden mats that could halt a breakthrough. At night, one could follow the course of the waters by observing the fires set at intervals by flood watchers, who huddled in mat shelters to keep out of the weather. They constantly filled and lit their pipes in order to stay awake, and every hour measured the height of the dark waters that glided so silently, so menacingly past their emergency stations. As with the Battle of the Fields, there was in this struggle neither ultimate victory nor a final defeat, but only an endless series of tactical gains and losses. Here a dike that held, a whole county saved, there a river run riot, 1 million people left homeless and hungry. But even this battle, gigantic and far-flung as it was dwarfed that year by yet another conflict, a civil war almost as cosmic in scale as the monsoon itself. From the borders of Siberia to the mouth of the Red River in the South China Sea, armies red and white marched and countermarched, encircled and counter-encircled, besieged and broke siege in turn until over vast areas of countryside, every nursing child, every worried mother, every grandfather filling his pipe by the village gate, every young man with a hoe on his shoulder, and every young woman with a needle in her hand had experienced this war. Top-level squires and rural bullies fled for safety to Beijing, Tianjin, Mukden, Shanghai, and even New York. Second-ranking gentlemen ran to such provincial towns as Taiyuan, Jinan, Baoting, and Kaifeng. Those of third rank took refuge behind the thick fortress walls of county seats, such as Anyang, Yungnien, Kalgan, and Datung. Lesser fry, lacking the means to get away, threw themselves on the mercy of the newly empowered peasants' associations and village congresses, and lived for the day when the Home Return Corps, organized in the cities by their fleeing brethren, would sally forth to wreak vengeance. These brethren, in turn, fully controlling the coastal cities and still able to deploy the manpower of vast areas in South and West China, placed their hopes for victory on supply lines that reached out across the wide Pacific into the streets and workshops of America, where hundreds of thousands toiled to make the weapons with which Chinese might slaughter Chinese. In this, the Armageddon of Chinese feudalism, the terrible many-layered war of the land revolution, no weapon was overlooked. The very floods of the monsoon became swords in the hands of opposing armies, and silt-swollen rivers were unleashed by both sides in an effort to annihilate the enemy or split his forces asunder. At Yungnien, a black-walled fortress city halfway between Beijing and the Yellow River, a Kuomintang warlord named Yang entrenched himself with flour, wine, and women for a 3-year siege. Communist-led militia, driven back when they tried to storm the battlements by frontal assault, raised a dike around the town and turned the waters of the Wei River upon it. Just before the rising flood burst open the city's massive gates, bombers, summoned by radio from Beijing, blasted the dike and loosed a torrent that spread havoc through 3 counties. Farther north, in central Hopei, American-equipped troops under General Fu Tzuyi drove south out of Tianjin in the middle of the rainy season and cut the dikes of the Grand Canal just as the crest of the flood rolled down. 5 counties west of the canal were inundated. Hundreds of people drowned. Tens of thousands lost their homes and harvests. By this action, General Fu's armies won a respite of several weeks from partisan attacks in the famed Beijing-Tianjin-Baoting Triangle, an area the Japanese, in 8 long years, had never been able to pacify. Devastating as these hydraulic thrusts proved to be, they were mere hose play compared to the return of that fearsome dragon, the Yellow River, to the course from which it had been blasted 10 years before in a vain attempt to stop Japan's headlong drive southward. The rediversion was carried out in March 1947 by the Kuomintang Army with the aid of United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration technicians, funds, and supplies, and on orders from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek himself. The river, rushing back into its pre-war bed, cut the liberated area of Shantung in half, placed half a mile of water between the Shanxi-based revolutionary armies of One-Eyed General Lu Paocheng in the west and the Shantung-based revolutionary armies of General Chen Yi in the east. The artificial flood disrupted the economy of a whole region. Some 500 villages that had housed 100,000 people for more than a decade were submerged within a few days. The high water that followed the summer rains threatened a plain inhabited by 5 million. When the peasants, by the hundreds of thousands, gathered to repair the long-abandoned dikes, Generalissimo Chiang sent bombers to blast the renovated earthworks and fighter planes to strafe the dike workers. Footnote: the bombing of these dikes was described to me by Philip Tomford of Pennsylvania, an agricultural officer of UNRRA, who witnessed it. It was also documented by the Chinese Liberated Areas Relief Administration in the report of their work issued in Shanghai in 1948. Thus did the war grow in ferocity and ruthlessness. As both sides girded for increasingly decisive battle, the possibility of compromise receded swiftly into the background. Each day brought new evidence that 1947 would be a year of decision in China's modern history. In 1947, the Chinese Communist Party, confident of the strength of the 100 million people in the guerrilla base area of the north, moved from the defensive to the offensive in the war against the Kuomintang. Its military forces, completely encircled on land and without a single plane in the air, confounded friend and foe alike by suddenly thrusting 3 complete armies southward into the nationalist rear. In the center, General Lu's men drove all the way from the north bank of the Yellow River to the Tapye Mountains on the banks of the Yangtze overlooking Nanking. In the east, General Chen Yi filed down into North Kiangsu and Anhui to outflank the strategic railway town of Kaifeng. In the west, General Chen Keng forded the Yellow River and swept to the Hupei border, thus isolating Luoyang. By re-establishing 3 important guerrilla bases in East, Central, and West China, these 3 armies turned the war inside out, converted encirclement into counter-encirclement, and disrupted Chiang's plan to strangle the revolution in its war-devastated North China redoubt. The military offensive of 1947 was accompanied by an equally important political offensive. The heart of this second offensive was the draft agrarian law, formulated in the fall of 1947 and announced to the world on December 28th of that year. With sentences as abrupt as the strokes of a fodder-chopping knife, the new law proclaimed the death of landlordism. Article 1. The agrarian system of feudal and semi-feudal exploitation is abolished. The agrarian system of land to the tiller is to be realized. Article 2. Land ownership rights of all landlords are abolished. Article 3. Land ownership rights of all ancestral shrines, temples, monasteries, schools, institutions, and organizations are abolished. Article 4. All debts incurred in the countryside prior to the reform of the agrarian system are cancelled. With these provisions of the law, the revolutionaries of China once again threw down the gauntlet to Chiang Kai-shek and his American backers. They now demanded not some modified relationship between the classes, such as had served to unite the nation against Japan. not a settling of accounts with profiteers and collaborators such as had stirred the liberated areas after Japan's surrender, but the abolition of the rural class system itself, complete, unequivocal, universal. From the Amur to the Hainan, from Shanghai to Chengdu, the land must be distributed to those who worked it. The manner of the distribution was set forth in Articles 6 and 8. Article 6. All land of landlords in the village, all public land, shall be taken over by the village peasants' associations, and together with the other village lands, in accordance with the total population of the village, irrespective of male or female, young or old, shall be unifiedly and equally distributed. With regard to the quantity of land, surplus shall be taken to relieve dearth, and with regard to the quality of land, fertile land shall be taken to supplement infertile, so that all the people of the village shall obtain land equally, and it shall be the individual property of each person. Article 8. Village peasants' associations shall take over the landlord's animals, agricultural implements, houses, grain, and other properties, shall further expropriate the surplus animals, agricultural implements, houses, grain, and other properties of rich peasants, and these shall be distributed to peasants lacking these properties, and to other poor people, and furthermore, an equal portion shall be distributed to the landlords. The property distributed to each person shall be his personal property, thus enabling all village people to obtain proper materials for production and for livelihood. This new draft agrarian law was destined to play as important a role in China's Civil War of 1946 to 1950 as the Emancipation Proclamation played in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation confiscated without compensation $3 billion worth of property and slaves, put an end to the possibility of compromise between the industrial North and the slaveholding South in the military contest then raging, made the slave system itself, rather than regional autonomy, the nub of the conflict, cleared the way for the recruitment of hundreds of thousands of emancipated black men into the Union Army, and spread the war into every corner of Confederate territory, with devastating effect. Mao's draft agrarian law confiscated without compensation $20 billion worth of property and land, put an end to all possible compromise between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, made countrywide overthrow of the landlords and compradors, rather than the defense of the liberated areas, the main aim of the war, facilitated the capitulation and recruitment of huge blocks of Jiang soldiers into the People's Liberation Army, inspired peasant unrest in the far corners of China, and gave impetus to demonstrations of workers, students, merchants, and professional people in urban centers throughout the Kuomintang rear. Nor was the impact of the new draft law confined, as one might suppose, to territories as yet unconquered by the revolution. Inside the old liberated areas, where land reform in one form or another had begun the day the Japanese surrendered, the draft law inaugurated a new stage in the continuing struggle. Its provisions served as a yardstick by which to measure the achievements of 3 years, 1945 to 1947, of more moderate reforms in an area as large as France and Germany combined. Had the land been equally divided? Had the political power of the gentry been broken? Had the poor peasants and hired laborers taken control of village affairs? If not, why not? The new draft law also served as a yardstick by which to measure the political position of every revolutionary, of every Communist Party member, of every government functionary, every leader of a mass organization, and every individual teacher, peasant, student, peddler, worker, soldier, tradesman, or intellectual who opted for progress and a new democratic China. On which side do you stand? Do you stand with the poor peasants and hired laborers, the most oppressed and exploited people in the nation, or do you stand with the landlords, the rich peasants, and the feudal exploiters? Do you intend to carry the revolution through to its end by creating a new system of land tenure, or do you intend to stand in the way, to act as a brake, to stop things halfway? With the promulgation of the new draft law, a thunder and lightning, drum and cymbal attack was launched on the remnants of traditional exploitation and on the residues of landlord and rich peasant thinking in the revolutionary ranks throughout the liberated areas of North China. In honor of the campaign, red flags, which had entirely disappeared during the years of the Japanese War, suddenly blossomed over streets, courtyards, and village gates. The Chinese sun on a blue field, symbol of the anti-Japanese United Front, vanished from the badges that adorned many caps and lapels, and in its place the red star and hammer and sickle emblem reminiscent of the Red Army of the 1930s reappeared. Down from the compound walls came the 6-feet-high slogans of moderation and defense, and up in their place went the flaming words of the offensive, equally divide the land, and drive to Nanking, capture Chiang alive. The Lunar New Year, traditionally an occasion for week-long feasting, relaxation, and Chinese opera, was transformed that winter into a mass demonstration of support for the Chinese Communist Party, the draft agrarian law, and the leadership of Mao Zedong. In Changchi City, the main urban center of the South Shanxi Highlands, local residents and peasants from the surrounding villages turned out by the thousands to celebrate 1948. The city was decorated from one end to the other. In front of every shop, a bright red flag, replete with gold hammer and sickle, proudly waved. Across the streets and alleys, on all but invisible strings, fluttered countless pennants of colored paper. Each bore a slogan supporting the new land law or denouncing Chiang Kai-shek and his bandit gang. From a distance, these pennants looked like red and blue confetti dancing in the sun. Along 3 of the 4 main streets, north, south, and west, stages large enough for full-scale theatrical performances were set up on heavy timbers and hung with red silk. Peasants, pouring through the recently leveled gates of the walled town, jammed the roadways with their animals and vehicles. From the valleys came mule carts with iron-shod wooden wheels 4 foot in diameter. From the mountain heights came ridiculous little donkey-drawn vehicles with platforms 3 feet across and wheels the size of cooking pots. On the wooden framework of these carts, large and small, sat mothers, grandmothers, and children of all ages, dressed in bright silks and many-colored cottons. Among the attractions which drew them to the town was the Yangko dancing. A small parade preceded the performance of each Yangko team. In the lead came young men with red banners bearing the name of the club, block committee, or peasants' association which they represented. Behind them came the musicians with their drums, cymbals, gongs, and pipes. Next came the acting group, and then a long column of dancers. When the group arrived at a likely spot, any place where large numbers of people stood around waiting for something to happen, the dancers started to form a big circle doing the Yangko rock, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, the body swaying in time to the music, the arms swinging gracefully. The girls all carried wide scarves of silk that were tied to their waists with large red bows. They held the 2 free ends in their hands, so that the silk waved and fluttered with each movement of the arms. Like shimmering butterflies, they wove figure 8s and clover leaves and other intricate patterns, and finally formed a circle inside of which the actors assembled to perform the plays and skits which they themselves had written. The most popular theme of those many plays was land reform. The 2 points which most of them hammered home were the need to depend on the poor and hired peasants and the importance of uniting with the middle peasants. Many groups portrayed a villainous landlord who tried to sabotage all land division, a rich peasant who schemed with him, a middle peasant who worried lest the new land law be used against him, and a village political worker who sold out the poor for favors from the rich. But a hired laborer with the help of a Communist Party member always won the confidence of the people in the end. The landlord and his running dog cowered in disgrace. The poor peasants danced a merry jig with the middle peasant, while the boys and girls of the dancing brigade burst into joyous song and began their Yangko all over again. Other skits had to do with the national and international scene. Chiang Kai-shek came in for much buffeting about, as did the Sungs, the Kungs, and the Chens, China's 3 other ruling families. These men were represented in typical fashion, Sung always with a Western-style hat, Chen in a black landlord's gown, Chiang in preposterous military regalia, and Kung, the banker, always clutching a large briefcase stuffed with money. Adding to the merriment and confusion of sound were other groups performing stick dances. The participants carried bamboo rods about 3 feet long that were decorated at each end with bells and tassels. To a very fast beat, these sticks were struck against different parts of the body, and with each blow, the bells jingled. When 20 or 30 people did this in perfect unison, the rhythmic effect stirred the feet of every bystander. The streets overflowed with Yangko and stick dancers, each orchestra trying to play louder than the last, each group of dancers striving to step out more vigorously than the one in front of it, each actor attempting to outdo in gesture and voice the others in the cast. Add to this the thousands upon thousands of country people milling about, the peddlers vending hot mutton soup, candy, peanuts, and pears, the hundreds of carts going and coming, the red banners and the colored paper spinning and twirling in the air. It was a scene of immense vigor and public rejoicing, such as that ancient county town had rarely, if ever, witnessed. And, as if all this were not enough, the three great stages on the three main streets presented a continuous succession of plays, each to an enormous changing crowd. Farther on, at the fairgrounds on the east side of town, a commercial circus displayed the talents of trained monkeys and trick riders, while, from the platform of an abandoned temple, a traditional opera troupe sang to an audience of thousands. For 2 days and nights the festivities continued without let-up. I observed the tumultuous New Year activity in Changchi as a member of the faculty of Northern University, the educational and cultural center of the Shanxi, Hebei, Honan, Shantung border region. I had come to China 1 year earlier as a tractor technician with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and had been sent to the communist-led area of South Hebei to supervise a project there. When UNRRA closed down all over the world in the fall of 1947, the tractors under my care were put in storage for lack of gasoline, and I accepted an invitation from Northern University to teach English in South Shanxi. The university was a guerrilla institution which moved according to the dictates of war. It was housed at that time in a huge expropriated mission compound at Kao Settlement, a village in the 5th district of Lucheng County, 10 miles north of Changchi. I had no sooner settled down to teach there than half the faculty and students of the institution departed to join the land reform movement, an exodus that occurred a few days after the New Year celebrations. Hundreds of volunteers from the university joined an equal number of local, county, and sub-county district cadres. Footnote: the Chinese word for cadre is kanpu, which means backbone personnel. It has no satisfactory English equivalent, even though it is commonly translated by the French word cadre. Since cadre, as ordinarily used in English, means a group of trained persons, it is not exactly suitable for referring to individual members of such a group. Yet the Chinese word is used both for the group and for the individual. In this book, the word cadre is used to designate any person who plays a full or part-time leading role in any area of political activity, whether it be the government, the Communist Party, or the Peasants' Association. It is also used to describe technical personnel in industry, agriculture, education, etc., who are employed by the government. Hundreds of volunteers from the university joined an equal number of local, county, and sub-county or district cadres to make up work teams that were assigned to key villages throughout the region. In groups of 10 or 12, these cadres went out to survey the true condition of the peasant population and carry the land reform through to completion. The excitement generated by the departure of so many of its students and staff members electrified the whole university. Young men and women in blue ran back and forth, tying up belongings, rolling their quilts into tight bundles, fastening shoulder straps to improvised bedrolls, singing snatches of song and talking excitedly to one another. Many who had not been chosen to go stood around with wistful expressions, revealing how much they too would have liked to be on their way to the countryside. When, at last, all the volunteers were ready, they assembled in the street with their bundles on their backs and a bright red flag flying over them. The president of the university, the famous historian Fan Wenlan, lean, slightly stooped, peering with failing eyes through thick glasses, gave them a gentle, scholarly farewell talk. Then, to the accompaniment of rolling drums and clashing cymbals, the adventurous brigade strode off. At the first crossroad, it split into 2 columns, one marching east, the other south. Last farewells were said, and handshakes quickly concluded. One student grabbed the staff of the red flag and waved it high in the air. Others put their caps on their walking sticks and whirled them triumphantly overhead. The swiftly moving volunteers gradually merged into the landscape, leaving only 2 streaks of wind-whipped dust hanging over the paths they had taken. In the wide, bright sky, clouds like puffs of cotton sped southward on the wind. The mountains in the distance were white with the year's last snow. At least it seemed to be the last, for the breath of spring in the air that day made one forget winter. Soon the peasants would be out plowing, and before the time to plant arrived, 10 million ragged, landless families would join that vast army of those who already owned their own good earth. Standing in the road, watching the dust kicked up by the students' departure gradually settle, I was overcome with longing to join the great adventure. My job at the university was to teach English, but how could the teaching of English compare with the remolding of the world through land reform? I walked directly from the edge of the village to President Fan's office on the second floor of the enormous cow settlement monastery. The president was in. Quietly, with sympathetic attention, he listened to my plea. "Here is one of history's great moments," I said. "I want to see and take part in it more than I have ever wanted to do anything in my life. Can't I join one of the teams, at least as an observer, and learn at first hand what the land reform is all about?" President Fan could not give me an immediate answer. He had to consult with the sub-regional and county authorities. 3 days later, he called me in and said that I could go to one of the nearby villages where a land reform work team was already stationed, on condition that I continue to teach a few English classes each week. He assigned a young woman instructor, Chi Yun, to accompany me and to act as my interpreter. The village nearest to Cow Settlement that had been chosen as a base for the work of a land reform team was a community named Longbow. It lay approximately 1 mile to the south. I had already walked through it several times, had even had a bowl of hot soup at the village inn there on one occasion, but had heretofore paid very little attention to the place. It was, outwardly at least, no different from 1,000 other hamlets that dotted the valleys of South Shanxi. As a matter of fact, I was a little disappointed that the land reform which I was to observe was to take place right at the doorstep of the university. It would be more adventurous to walk to some distant place, to work in some isolated valley that I had not yet seen. But I had no alternative. Since both Chi Yun and I had to teach, we either had to choose the nearest village or not go at all. On the morning of March 6, 1948, the two of us finally set off for the first time on the road to Longbow and began the long process of getting to know its people, their history, their progress, their mistakes, and their complex current problems.